Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Blue Maxima. Welcome back to Blue Boards. This time we're going to be talking about Blood on the Clocktower. And the thing about Blood on the Clocktower is that it's kind of hard to do visual aids for it when there's no such thing as a physical copy of the game at this point, so this is going to be entirely audio based, so feel free to just swap to another tab, play a game of solitaire, do what the kids do these days, I don't bloody know, and just listen for a bit, because there's a lot about Blood on the Clocktower that I really should like, for no word of a doubt. It's got a lot of neat ideas. It twists the idea of the social deduction formula in a lot of different ways, and most of them are outright positive, but I gotta tell you, man, even after having spent 6 months playing this, trying to figure out all of its intricacies, trying to figure out how to play properly, I just can't see myself wanting to actually play the game again. And that's disappointing, and I will get to the multiple reasons why later on in this video. With that said, Blood on the Clocktower is a social deduction game. You've got two teams, the townsfolk and the outsiders, who are the good team, and the minions and the demon, who are the evil team. The evil team needs to kill as many of the good team as possible so that they outnumber the good team, and therefore they just win. The good team needs to find out who the evil team are through social deduction, through using their abilities very carefully, and using them in order to figure out who it is and have them lynched, basically. Have them voted out at the end of the day. Everyone has a unique role at the beginning of the game, but this unique role is not known to the other players, so everyone needs to spend time talking to each other in order to share information, figure out who's who, and use that in order to bring the game forward to a victory condition. And this is done via the night phase, where a lot of powers go off, the demons make their kills if they can, and then the day phase, where everyone gets the opportunity to talk, and then someone is voted off the circle. And it just continues on like that until the game ends. It's a relatively simple structure to understand, and it's very similar to other social deduction games of its kind. But there are a few things that Blood on the Clocktower does to elevate this concept up a bit, including the Game Master, who not only sets out the game at the beginning in order to balance the roles out and make sure there aren't too many powerful roles on one or the other side of the conflict, but there is also the fact that they can balance what happens in the game. So, for example, there is one role called the Recluse, and while the Recluse is technically an outsider, which is a general set of roles, which is, let's say they are on the good team, but they have abilities that can't really be considered good. In this particular case, this character has the ability to show up as evil when pinged, when investigated, when just looked at by the role of a good player. Now, the storyteller in charge has the opportunity to make them look one way or the other, which might help the balance of the game. So, for example, if the Recluse is tied up in a sort of thing which is like, hey, this might be the good or the evil player, if someone looks at it and the storyteller decides to tell this player that this person is good, then it might narrow down the potential candidates for who's evil and tip the game in good's favor. But if they show off as evil, it gives the evil team a bit more cover and might tip it in their favor. The job of the storyteller is to balance these abilities, and there are multiple abilities like this that can turn up through a game, so the storyteller can keep the game going for as long as possible and generally try to ride it down to the final 3. That's their job, more or less, most of the time. And it is a really cool system in theory, and a lot of the time it does work, and as a result, it makes for a more interesting game at the very least more often. And it also helps that there is a ton of roles, a lot of which have their own unique interactions. I already talked about how there's the Outsiders group just in general, right, that has abilities that aren't particularly great for the good team, but they still technically count as the good team. Well, there are a lot of roles and powers for both sides that continue to make things interesting. And on top of that, the game encourages throwing all of these roles together in what they call scripts. And putting all of these different roles together can create entirely different experiences, and it makes things quite interesting as a result. However, there are 3 scripts in the box that they include just flat out that are good for starting players, intermediate players, and expert players respectively. There's Trouble Brewing, which mostly has just correct information and is just figuring out the puzzle, and there's very little that the storyteller can do to sway it. Meanwhile, there is Sex and Violence, which is based around the concept of poisoning, which gives people inaccurate information, and half the puzzle is trying to figure out what information is good and what information is bad. And then you've got Bad Moon Rising, which has a lot of roles that can cause death. Whether it be, hey, I picked out that someone is some role, I got it right, and I died because I got it right. Or there's roles that'll encourage invincibility, and there's multiple demons that can do multiple kills at once, and there's another minion role that can also do a kill. So it's all about trying to figure out what did what and when in order to figure out whose role was right. And it creates a lot of really interesting interaction if your storyteller knows what they're doing. And it also helps that the game's got a bunch of unique ideas that help keep other players in the loop. Now, for example, in most social deduction games, once you're dead, you're dead. You can't really do anything, right? In Blood on the Clocktower, you're still allowed to interact with people. You're still allowed to just have talks, try and figure out the puzzle for yourself. And you also have what's called a death vote, which means you can come back from the dead one last time in order to point the finger at someone and get them killed off. Which means that you've still got a little bit of sway in the game, which helps keep you engaged towards the end, which is, again, a good thing. And the game's also got roles for people who will need to leave relatively quickly, or people who have come in like during the second day or something, called travelers, which can also affect the game, but usually not so much as to cause the entire game to sway, which is quite useful. And they also give out 3 roles that aren't in the game to any evil players, so that they have the opportunity to pick out a role and bluff as it, figure out what the information might be because they know everyone in the circle that's evil, and they can be like, hey, I know this piece of info despite the fact that they're talking out of their butt cheeks. And so it does a lot of little things right. It really does. And when you have a really good game going, when you have all of the roles laid out in front of you, when you can figure out based on the information that someone has given you that has been verified by someone else, that's been verified by someone else, you can determine a bunch of things about the circle of players. You can determine who's where and why, and you can make some reasonable guesses. And these are some of the most satisfying kinds of games that you can play in this game system. However, I have spent 6 months playing Clocktower both online and offline, and I've played like easily an average of 2 games a week. So chances are I've played well over 50 games at this point, and the ratio of those perfect games where things feel like they're relatively under control and you have the ability to figure things out and not just fire blindly in the dark, the ratio of those games is, to be honest, incredibly low, because something almost always gets in the way. So let me tell you about the barrier to entry with this game. So it's basically a 135-degree cliff. Like, it hangs over the top of you and you've got no safety gear because, as I said, there are tons of different roles. There's like 100 of them. And even if you're just playing like off the 3 basic scripts, that's still 30-something roles you need to learn about. That's still 3 different scripts you need to worry about. And when you're playing with a different set of roles on a different script, the way that everyone wakes up in the middle of the night, the way that they use their abilities, and the way that the abilities of earlier players can affect later players can change drastically. And if you aren't acutely aware of how these things can change when you're trying to bluff, or when you're trying to tell the truth, or when you're trying to use an ability, it's going to screw you over, and it's going to screw you over hard, and it can make this game absolutely infuriating to try and get into. Especially if you're not going into a brand new Clocktower group. Everyone to the game is new, everyone's trying their best, everyone's starting on Trouble Brewing, which is the simple script and is the one they recommend for everyone. If you end up finding a group that ends up going between all 3 different scripts, and you're just brain dead trying to go through them all, there's nothing you can do. Unless you're actively going to sit down and study every single script and every single role and every single page on the Blood on the Clocktower wiki, you are not going to be able to get this shit in your head, and you are going to end up having a lot of bad games on the way, because you're going to screw over the evil team because you didn't know a vital piece of information. You're going to try and bluff as something, but you're not going to know that something else would have changed the result of that as you went, and you're going to screw over the evil team. you're not going to know how a specific role or a specific ability works because it's your first time playing it, and you're not going to dive straight for the Blood on the Clocktower wiki because you just don't know to do that, and you're not going to use the role properly. Everyone's going to be suspicious of you, and that's going to end up being a bad game for you. And it really doesn't help when that's your problem. When you don't know the rules because the game is genuinely incredibly complex. I'd call this one of the most complex games I've ever played because of the way that the night orders work, the way the roles work, the way that they can interact with each other. It genuinely ends up being one of the most complicated games imaginable, especially if you're going back and forth between 3 different scripts. But there's also the problems of not only other people being bad players, whether on purpose or accidental, or they just didn't know what they were doing, the storyteller not knowing what they're doing, or just having some really, really bad luck. And allow me to give you an example of a Blood on the Clocktower game that I played this one time, right? So this was on the Sex and Violets script, and I was playing a character called the Evil Twin, who knows a good player and their role, but the good twin also knows they have an evil twin and they know who they are. So both of them tend to come out at the same time and say, hey, this is the evil twin, no, this is the evil twin, and they just kind of have that sort of bickering fight in the town square while everyone else goes off and does their thing. And I knew the role of the good player was the town crier, which is you learn if a minion, I don't remember if it was nominated or voted yesterday, but it was one of the two, right? It's one that I could effectively get the correct information for because I was on the evil team. I was the evil twin, I knew all the other minions, so I could actually give out the correct information. And I sat there for the first day just working out who was going to be voting, who was going to set off my ability. And then, during the night, unbeknownst to me, they had not told me this, they simply met in private to discuss this and then didn't bother telling me about it. They pulled a really shitty move where another minion was what was known as a pit hag, which can change another role. So they changed the demon from not the Vortox, which is into the Vortox. And the Vortox is a role that invalidates all good information. So basically it's like, did you get a yes? You're getting a no now. Did you get a 0? Well, you're probably going to get a 1 or a 2 or a 3. It makes the information incorrect in some way, shape or form. And so as a result, on day 2, when we both ended up giving out our information, I didn't know that a Vortox had been put into play. So when we gave out our information, I gave out the wrong answer, the other player gave out the right answer, and as a result, everyone immediately knew that I was the evil twin. That was just it. And as a result, I just got to sit there for 2.5 hours while everyone else just left me alone. And the evil team just went and did their own thing. And I just got to sit there. Nobody would talk to me because everybody already knew I was the evil twin. And then, at the end of the game, despite the fact that I had been paying enough attention to know, don't go into this person, don't use your demon ability to leap into this person because they're the most suspicious right now, the evil team decided to do that anyway and we just lost. So, 2 really bad maneuvers on the evil team side meant that I basically just got to sit there for 2.5 hours and watch us lose. And it was so infuriating that I almost refused to not play another Blood on the Clocktower game for a very long time. I've played like 1 game since then. And while this is an extreme example, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't also uncommon and less extreme. So let me give you another one. I was playing a role known as the Seamstress, where you pick 2 players and you learn whether or not they're good. Both of them are good, both of them evil, or it's one or the other. You get a yes if they're the same alignment, or no if they're a different alignment. Makes perfect sense. I thought to myself, I'll save this for a couple of things, because I hadn't been the Seamstress before. So I saved it for a couple of nights, and then on night 3, when I was going to go use it, I got killed. And so when I woke up and people asked me what my role was, they said, what was it they said? Oh, you should have used it on night 1. You should have just done that immediately. And how the hell was I supposed to know that without having to go and look it up on the Blood on the Clocktower wiki or what have you? Because, yeah, There are a lot of situations like that where you'll just be accused of being evil and then you'll just be left alone for the rest of the game because of something that you didn't know you should have done and therefore doesn't really feel like your fault. And of course, it doesn't help when the game itself can kind of conspire against you. So, another game. Trouble brewing this time. I was the chef, or at least I thought I was. The chef basically learns how many pairs of evil players there are, how many of them are sitting next to each other in the circle. I learned a 1, which was false because I was actually technically the drunk, which is basically you think you're one role, but you're another role and your information is incorrect. It makes sense on the grand scheme of things, but we needed to figure out whether or not the info I had was true or not true. And there was another role called the Raven Keeper. If it dies in the night, it can pick another player and learn their role. So when the Raven Keeper died in the night, fantastic, pick me, figure out if my information is correct. So it would have normally seemed drunk, but because the Poisoner had managed to get to the Raven Keeper on the same night that the Raven Keeper was murdered, and the Poisoner gets to go first in the turn line, that means that the Raven Keeper actually saw me as the chef, and therefore there was no realistic way for me to figure out whether or not I was actually the chef. A lot of games turn out like this, where the information just gets so confused and muddy that you have no way to figure out whether or not you're actually who you say you are, whether or not a certain piece of information is correct, and it feels like you're firing in the dark a lot. And it doesn't help, because again, all of these potentials, combined with having to try to learn 3 scripts at once, combined with trying to learn all these roles at once, combined to having to try and get all of this in your head at the same time. And then, on top of that, your storyteller can be potentially wrong. They might not understand a rule. They might send you through an entire game for 2 to 3 hours, only for you to find out at the end that they didn't understand how poisoning works, and therefore the entire game was null and void because we didn't know who the bloody demon was. Literally impossible to figure it out because the lines of logic had been messed up. Just things along those lines, and it's genuinely infuriating. Whether it be things like that, or even something as simple as the positioning of roles inside the circle that can cause you to think that you're one thing or another, or that you just end up like next to a demon that poisons you, so your information is completely useless and you've been doing nothing the entire game. Or you've been just any one of these situations where you feel useless either through not knowing the game well enough, or through just a complete luck roll of the dice, or through your teammates doing something incredibly stupid and not warning you about it. Just as a result, a lot of your chances of having fun can feel like it's a roll of the metaphorical dice. And I've just had so many bad games of Blood on the Clocktower that I just don't want to play it anymore. And that's the God's honest truth. I like a lot of what it does. Everything between the game master, the storyteller, trying to keep the game balanced, all of the different roles and the ways they can interact with each other, and creating different scripts that can have completely different gameplay experiences due to the way all the roles interact with each other. All the little things like death votes keeping people in the game for longer, demon bluffs so that they don't have to take an absolute shot in the dark as to who's in the game and who's not. The travelers being able to come in, but having actually played 6 months worth of games, I end up coming out more frustrated than amused than having actually enjoyed myself. I was genuinely angry at the end of that 3-hour game. I genuinely wanted to yell at everybody in that room, because do you know how frustrating it is when everyone else goes around and has their fun for 2.5 to 3 hours while you're just sitting there with absolutely nothing to do? It's just genuinely maddening, and it was just the climax of a bunch of games that had gone wrong for not so much completely different reasons, but for different reasons that seem based around the same basic ideas. The game is incredibly hard to learn, and one mistake can not only screw up the game for you, but for everyone else. The fact that just complete and utter bad luck can result in you sitting around for 3 hours waiting for the game to be over. And I genuinely can't justify saying that a game like that is worth playing, even if there are those rare diamonds in a massive sea of cow shit where that everything goes perfectly, you can figure it out in your head, or at the very least, at the end of the game, you can say, I could have figured this out had I just thought this through a little bit differently. But those games are so rare that I can't say I recommend Blood on the Clocktower. Not as it is, but at the same time, I don't know how you would change the game to fix this sort of thing without changing the entire concept of the game in the first place. So, yeah. And everyone else around me still loves this bloody game. So who knows? Maybe this is just me and my natural horrific luck just causing me to be in a bad position so much. But yeah, I can't play it anymore. I just can't justify the time. I've already spent 6 months. I've spent like hours upon hours trying to learn the game. And after that 3-hour bullshit, I was just done. I was just done. There you go. There is my thoughts on Blood on the Clocktower. This has been Blue Maxima. I'll see you all next time.